Hi, Misha here. And when you think of big, impressive navies, you don't often think of that of Italy. In fact, their navy was so obsolescent in 1921-22, when the Washington Naval Treaty was signed, that they, along with France, were exempted from the holiday on building new battleships, and were allowed to build up to a certain tonnage. Something they did not actually do until the 1930s. They did build some fast cruisers in the 20s, and France would ultimately build the Dunkirk-class. And then, once France had kind of committed their tonnage, Italy would finally lay down this class, the Littorio, or the Vittorio Veneto, depending on which you want to use. And so I thought we would talk about these. They originally planned 4 and laid down 4, of which 3 were completed. And these would be the most advanced Italian battleships in World War II. And actually were quite a threat to the British in the Mediterranean, at least for the first couple of years of the war, more so than the Germans. So we have 2 models. Here is the Littorio herself. This is a 1/1100 scale die-cast from Eagle Moss. And over here we have her sister ship Roma, the last of the 3 to be launched. This is a 1/1250 scale from De Agostini, also die-cast. Sorry, I don't have Vittorio. But anyway, these will work. And since we've already talked about the Dunkirk and the Nelsons, time to give Italy a little bit of its due, because it had a navy worth note, believe it or not. So with that, let's get into it. So yeah, 1922, the Washington Naval Treaty is in effect, and Italy is allowed 70,000 tons to build new warships. And the Allies were really pushing Italy to build a bunch of small, light ships with relatively small guns. But they really held off throughout the 1920s as Mussolini took hold and consolidated his power. And they didn't have a great deal of funding. It wasn't until around 1927, 1928 that the first designs really were presented to the Navy. And early on, they looked at doing a 23,500 ton ship. This was thought, well, hey, we can have 2 in service and 1 being refit and port at any time. They also made an early proposal for building 2 35,000 ton ships. And guns were looked at all over the place, but really mostly between 13.5 and 16 inches. But in 1930, Germany announced the new Deutschland-class, which Britain often called a pocket battleship, and this spurred France to build the Dunkirk. Now the Deutschlands had 11-inch guns, the Dunkirks had 13. So a lot of designs were proposed, and this is when Italy finally gets serious about using its tonnage. It looked at things as light as 18,000 tons, but yeah, it pretty quickly looked at 13.5-inch guns in several different different calibers, different turret arrangements, 6 to 8. And then it again looked at the 35,000 ton design. And this is kind of an early favorite, and they would have had 16-inch guns. So they were pretty much set on a 35,000 ton battleship that they could build 2 of with 6 16-inch guns each. However, they realized one thing. They did not have a 16-inch gun available. Could they build one, develop one? Sure, but it would take time, and we're starting a new naval arms race. So they go back to a 15-inch gun that had already previously been developed for a canceled class, and they go, nah, good enough, let's do that. So that's the genesis of the Littorio-class. Interestingly, because the Italian Navy was operating in the Mediterranean, they wanted firepower, speed, and armor, but range and duration were not important because they were going to be near port at any time. So they made that kind of sacrifice. Therefore, on paper, they claimed it was a 35,000 ton. Truth is, it actually was a 40,000 ton ship, which was over the London Treaty and the Washington Treaty's limits, but c'est la vie. Who would know, right? And it would have 9 15-inch guns, and its secondary battery would be 12 6-inch guns, and then it would have 12 more 3.5-inch guns, and then it would have some 4.7-inch guns and some 37mm guns, all kinds of guns. Guns. And she was quite fast for a battleship at 30 knots, at least planned speed. And she would carry 3 planes for reconnaissance on the back there, with a catapult, 1 catapult. And she would have a crew of 1,750 men and 80 officers, give or take, if she was being used as a flagship. And she would have armor, of course, rated to defend against 13-inch guns and up to 15-inch, hopefully, meaning she was a pretty powerful ship. And so, in 1934, the project officially began, and a new arms race before World War II began. So why the confusion over the name? Vittorio or Littorio? Well, they were actually both laid down at the exact same time, October 28, 1934. And actually, Vittorio was launched first in July of 1937, but Littorio was right behind her in August. And it took some time to fit them out for all kinds of reasons, economics, having everything ready. And let's be honest, Italy's shipbuilding industry wasn't the most advanced and adept and practiced. Not saying they were poor, but, you know. So it wasn't until 1940, again, Vittorio was delivered first in April, but she was still, even though she was delivered to the Navy, she still needed work. And then Littorio was delivered on May 6th, a little more complete than Vittorio had been. And then Vittorio was declared complete on May 12th. So one was delivered first, but one was complete kind of first. It goes back and forth. Long story short, both were declared operational on August 2nd, 1940. So again, they laid down at the same time and they were declared fully operational at the same time. So take it as you will. Typically, Vittorio was kind of ahead of Littorio, but not always. What they ended up with was a ship just over 780 feet long. Standard weight, dry weight, was just under 41,000 tons. And fully loaded, it was over 45,000 tons, which, you know, I know math is not everyone's strong suit, but that is a little over the 35,000 ton limit, you might notice. One innovative feature that they tried on these warships was a new style of torpedo armor, which honestly didn't prove all that successful, but it was a state secret and it was fancy pants, and they were trying things. So they were declared operational, and at the end of August they set out on their first mission. It was to intercept a major convoy from Gibraltar to Malta. And it was the 2 new battleships, along with 3 older battleships of the Italian Navy, 10 cruisers, and 31 destroyers. So it was a big flotilla, big fleet. But their intel was faulty as to where exactly the British convoy was at, so they missed them. So they would sortie out for a few days and then return to port empty-handed. And then a month later, at the end of September, they would again try for the next convoy. And again, the British got lucky, the Italians did not get lucky. So they came back home yet again empty-handed. But the history was about to get a lot more interesting. On November 12, 1940, the British decided it was time to pay the Littorios a visit at their port in Taranto, because apparently they just couldn't find the British. So, that night, they launched Swordfish torpedo bombers and Swordfish armed with regular iron bombs. And it was a very successful raid. The British only lost 2 Swordfish, a couple more were damaged, and only had a few aviators killed, a couple more captured. But they dealt a very big blow to the Italian Navy that night. In fact, they nearly halved their battleship fleet in one night. Littorio was hit by 2 torpedoes, doing massive amounts of damage. Now, Littorio was unscathed, but some older battleships, cruisers, not to mention ammo dumps, fuel dumps, were all hit. It was pretty one-sided in favor of the British. Interestingly, on a historical front, there was a Japanese attaché there who witnessed the attack. He reported back to his Navy, and this really influenced the Pearl Harbor attack a year later. Seeing the ability of air power coming in, surprise, hit ships at port. So, yeah, with Littorio out of action, she would be put into dock for repairs from December 11 and be there until March 11 of 1941. Littorio was designated the flagship, and she was moved out of Taranto and moved to Naples for operations. And obviously wanting a go at the Brits, she would sortie out, and on November 26, we would end up with her in the Battle of Cape Spartivento. That battle would pretty much be a draw. Torpedo bomber Swordfish from Ark Royal would attempt to attack Littorio, but not score any hits. Likewise, Littorio would try attacking British ships and would get close on a cruiser but not do any real damage. So the only real loss was one of Littorio's reconnaissance planes. She would again return to port. The night of January 8 into the 9th, the RAF would take a go, sending heavy bombers against the port of Naples, but while some damage was done, Littorio again would escape unscathed. Then in February, she would go back to her favorite pastime, trying to attack the Malta convoy, but it wasn't the Malta convoy, it was Force H. Bad intel. But not much happened. They never made full contact. Back to port. Then in March, Germany, feeling that at least 2 of the Royal Navy's battleships operating near the Mediterranean and in the Mediterranean were disabled or unavailable, really pushed for Italy to send its battleships out to try to engage them. And so buckling under pressure from her ally. On March 26th, Littorio would again sortie out. This time they would go after convoys to Greece, and this would lead to an engagement known as the Battle of Cape Matapan. It would primarily be Royal Navy cruisers with air support from HMS Formidable. And finally, her luck would run out. She'd get one good torpedo hit on her, causing damage, quite a bit of flooding. They would also strike one of her escorting cruisers, and of course the convoy would make it safely. Littorio did do damage to at least one British warship, but it more or less went in the British's favor. So she would return, going back to Taranto at the end of the month, and she would be in port until July, having the torpedo damage repaired, leaving the newly repaired Littorio, this one here, the only one in operation. But by early August, the two sisters were again reunited. And again, at the end of that month and the end of September, they would sortie out looking for convoys and come back empty-handed. So, yay. Yeah, not a lot of luck with convoy duty here for either ship. And they keep running into torpedoes. But hey, they survived longer than Bismarck. Next, at the beginning of December, Littorio would be escorting an Italian convoy heading for North Africa, and she would be spotted and successfully torpedoed by HMS Urge, or Surge, I forget which. Anyway, a British submarine, doing yet more damage and sending her back to port for repairs. Therefore, on the 13th, Littorio would take over her duties, and she would be engaged by the British, leading to the inconclusive First Battle of Sirte. Throughout January and February, Littorio would continue to escort convoys, and then in March, when she was attacking a British convoy, it would lead to the Second Battle of Sirte, in which she would do damage to at least a couple of British destroyers. And by June, Littorio and Littorio would both be operational yet again, and go back to looking for Malta convoys, their favorite targets of all time. And on June 24, returning to port, it was Littorio's turn again. She would be hit by a bomb from a B-24, and later a torpedo from a Wellington. And you guessed it, back in for repairs. So I guess it's good they had two. They mostly had them at least one running at any time. And then at the end of the year, December 1942, because of the changing tides of war, both Littorio and Littorio were transferred to a new naval base, and their recently christened sister ship, Roma, would join them. Sorry these aren't exactly to scale with each other. Roma was laid down in September of 1938. Now, interestingly, the fourth member of the class, Emperor, was laid down earlier in May. And Emperor was launched in November of 1939. and Roma here was launched in June of 1940. But Emperor was never completed. In fact, she would become kind of a hulk, and there was a whole thing with Germany over her, but she was never at all completed. But Roma here was first declared complete in June of 1942, and was declared operational a couple of months later, which is how she was able to make the move to the new port of La Spezia in December of 1942. And this was done, of course, because of the successful North African invasion, the success of Operation Torch. The idea was to kind of get these three prized warships, especially Roma, brand new, out of the way of Allies. The problem is, by this point, even though the Allies didn't know it, these are still a threat. Italy really didn't have the fuel, other resources, or even manpower to launch all of these on a full operation. So they didn't really do much the spring of 43 because they couldn't. They set in port. And beginning in June, the Allies started launching bombing raids of different types, day, night, so on and so forth, to try to knock out the three Italian battleships, because these were still the biggest threat in the Mediterranean. At this point, Bismarck was under the waves, and Tirpitz seemed content to stay in its fjord up north. So these were really the only Axis battleships left of any note. It's also worth pointing out that the French Navy had been neutralized one way or the other by this point. So yeah, they were real keen to knock these out. And that ultimately ended up being kind of the downside to the whole Littorio-class. They were just big targets and expensive for Italy, who never had a whole lot of money to spare in the first place. On June 5th, the first major bombing raid, Roma would be damaged, but not too severely, and Littorio would be hit squarely with 2 bombs and some near misses and have to be relocated for repairs to a shipyard. Then on the 19th, there would be a second major bombing raid. This time, Littorio would get damaged. And then on a third raid, on the 23rd, Roma here would receive more damage, only partially repaired from the first time. And that was pretty much all she wrote. Italy would surrender in September, and the decision was taken to intern the 3 ships at Malta, along with most of the Italian Navy. It's also worth pointing out at that time, Littorio was renamed Italia after Mussolini was gone, end of his regime. So she got renamed. Roma stayed Roma. And Littorio would join them, the 3. And so on the way to Malta, you'd think their luck was over, but now it's the Germans that are after them, because again, big target. Whoever has these, it's still a powerful warship. So the Germans send bombers out with radio-controlled bombs, and well, they do some damage to Italia, formerly Littorio. Roma is their major victim. She gets hit with 2 bombs. It explodes her forward magazine, and she very promptly, this usually happens when your magazine explodes, sinks. So they did knock out 1. Vittorio and Littorio did make it to Malta, and from there they sailed to their permanent berths made for them at Alexandria. And for the rest of the war, they would kind of hang out around the Suez Canal. And to wrap things up, here are the 2 models side by side. The Eagle Moss is noticeably bigger. You know, on the smaller ships like destroyers, the difference between 1100 and 1250 isn't that noticeable, but as you get to bigger and bigger ships, it obviously opens up more and more to show. Not only is it a size difference, the 1100 really lets him have more details. I've noticed a lot of them more have airplanes on them, and the guns are quite a bit larger and more durable. Anyway, I think it's interesting. But yeah, they stayed in turn down in Egypt, and Littorio would be given to the British as war reparation, war prize in 1946, and then in 1947, Italia would be given to the Americans as their war prize. And nothing fun really happened, like, nothing with Operation Crossroads. Both ships were simply broken up for scrap. I mean, they studied them, obviously, but after doing some study, checking out what was going on here with the ships, both were broken up for scrap in 1948, thus ending the two remaining ships of Mussolini's prized fleet. And it was that way of thinking, that World War I and pre-World War I notion of battleships being prestige, and they were, but in World War II, even early on, it was clear that the aircraft carrier, and so battleships like these became status symbols, but big, expensive, and more of a target than an asset, and that really shows. So these would be the last, of course, battleships Italy would ever construct. And, of course, neither one was ever saved. They weren't bad ships. They were pretty middle of the road. I mean, 15-inch guns, quite impressive. They didn't have the range and the endurance of other ships, because that's not what Italy needed. So they didn't. They had good armor. They had quite decent guns. The torpedo protection never worked out as expected, but the top speed of 30 knots was pretty impressive. So, they have that. They're neat, and one of the lesser known ships, not as kind of strange looking as the French battleships, much more of a conventional, 2 forward super firing turrets and 1 rear, and dozens of other smaller guns here and there. But yeah, I just thought, why not cover these? These are the only Italian ships in either the De Agostini or the Eagle Moss collections. And, most of their careers they spent in port or being repaired, and Roma really just came in service long enough to get damaged and be captured. So not a lot for her there, and then should be sunk rather unceremoniously by the Germans. But anyway, hope you enjoyed this. Any questions or comments, please do post them. As always, if you could, like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha, and I will catch you very soon. Next time.